for this afternoon. And it's obviously going to be the most interesting session. I'd like to encourage you to come to the front if you can, because we're going to open up the session for questions and answers. And we want to hear from you on the panel, where we're going to be discussing the impact of crisis fatigue on humanitarian action. A lot of today's sessions have mentioned the role of media in promoting humanitarian action, and this panel is going to consist of members of the media, experts in the field who have decades of experience collectively. So I hope that you look forward to hearing from us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Testing. Okay, good. You're going to turn that off, right? You're going to turn that off, right? Turn it off, your phone.
Oh, I did. It's on.
Oh, okay. Oh my God, they're really loud.
They're loud, yeah?
They're quite loud. They're sensitive.
If everybody could make their way to the front, we're going to get started. And we'll have some questions, as Suzanne said, so we encourage everybody to come up to the front. We'll just give it one more minute. Okay, we're going to get started. If everybody could take their seats. Thank you. Hello, I'm Elise Labott, and today we're talking about evolving humanitarian needs and response, the impact of crisis fatigue on humanitarian crises. When news of a humanitarian crisis reaches what is commonly known as a breaking point, we know it receives significant coverage in the media. The television cameras are here. We often see horrifying images, and we hear heartbreaking personal stories from the ground. And the crises are trending on social media, and it all seizes the public interest and our empathy. But it's becoming harder and harder to maintain that interest for extended periods of time. Crisis fatigue sets in, and that's happening now even faster in the age of social media, where attention spans are even shorter and the next trending crisis consumes us. Or not even a crisis, the next trending story, I should say, consumes us. It's also becoming increasingly more difficult for media organizations to independently cover humanitarian crises. The inherent danger of conflict zones, where a large portion of humanitarian crises occur, have made media organizations more reluctant to send in journalists to cover these humanitarian crises, as do tighter budgets. And a lack of on-the-ground expertise often hinders journalists from effectively and efficiently acquiring accurate information. And all of this tends to lead to simplistic surface-level reporting and a disconnect between the international community and those directly affected by a humanitarian crisis and the average media consumer. So we're going through a technological revolution that gives us new formats and technologies to embrace in our effort to tell stories. So we're going to talk about how the media can effectively maintain the public's attention as this crisis fatigue sets in. How can media and humanitarian organizations work better together to effectively inform international stakeholders and the communities affected by humanitarian crises? And within partnerships, how can we ensure the public objectively and journalistic integrity are being maintained? So joining me today are an esteemed group of humanitarian aid officials, journalists, and editors who grapple with these issues at every humanitarian crisis. Rafiq El-Shafani is the Advocacy and Communications Director for UNICEF in the Gulf. Suzanne Kiampour is a journalist with the BBC. Faisal Abbas is the Editor-in-Chief of Arab News. And Brian Rohan is a long-time foreign affairs journalist. So let's get to it. Rafiq, I want to start with you. As someone on the ground, how does working in these affected areas of a humanitarian crisis, let's talk about how did the crisis fatigue, as we're talking about, actually translate on the operations front? How do we compare the first few days of an emergency and crisis compared to the months, weeks, and years after that?
Thank you, Elise, and really thanks to everyone in the room here in your interest in this session. And I think it shows that fatigue can be overcome just by having everyone around us here interested in this topic. At the onset of every crisis, the media attention is usually at its peak, unfortunately. And that's because of the newness of the crisis. And it's because the interest in it at all levels, the public, the politicians, the people affected themselves, and everyone else is at its highest. And I think this is where also, when we're talking about crisis fatigue, we have to understand, are we talking about fatigue about a single crisis, or are we fatigued from all the crises, from all the gloom and doom that we see in the media repeatedly every day and beyond? The second part is probably the most worrying one, when people stop being interested in what is going on around them because of this fatigue of the bad news. But I think the first part is also really important when, on a single crisis, let's take an example of the Syria-Turkey earthquake 2 weeks ago. A huge media attention on the first few days on the search and rescue operation, on the immediate effect of this devastating earthquake. But what we worry about is, are we covering the crisis or the effects of the crisis on people? This is the most important piece of the story, in my opinion, and this is what us, as humanitarians, we want to convey. The story is not about the crisis itself, it's about the people, the children, the families who have suffered that devastation and will sadly continue to suffer weeks, months after that. They have lost their homes, their schools, their hospitals, the water networks, all the public infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. And that effort will take quite a long time. And that attention and the support from people that the media attention and the story attention brings will affect the level of speed and action that the reconstruction, the relief items will get to the people. So the faster and the more media and attention we have on a certain crisis, I think the operation is more efficient. That's the translation.
Yeah, let's break down what's going on right now in Turkey and Syria, for instance, and the earthquake. There's been a huge attention on the search and rescue, but the search and rescue is just a very small part. What's really to come is really going to be, prolonged. Everything. These people have lost everything: schools, water network, everything's been destroyed, and this reconstruction is not really going to make the headlines, will it? I mean. And the biggest part is really going to be the rebuilding.
Absolutely. It's rebuilding the people themselves. Mental health will be a huge priority for us, for children. They have been traumatized by this devastating catastrophe. And their mental health is pretty much on the top of our priorities as response providers, as people who are accountable to children and for their well-being. And it will not take 1 day or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It will take a long time, a sustained effort to mitigate the effects of this devastating crisis on them. And this is even worse on the Syrian children who have been living in a conflict zone under extreme conditions.
A new crisis on top of crisis
Exactly.
fatigue there.
Exactly. And a lot of these children were born refugees. Some of them were born as displaced people, born in tents. All they've known is devastation, and this comes on top of it. And very sadly, these stories are not what we often see. And even when we see at the onset of a crisis, they are not there on the long run. So we find it a bit of a challenge to create narratives and to keep the people attentive and appeal for their support as we move away from the immediate first day, first week headlines.
Yeah. Faisal, let's talk about you. I want to bring up just like Afghanistan, for instance. There was coverage of the war when it first started and the invasion, and then for years there was no coverage. And then there was coverage of the surge, and then there was no coverage for a while. There was coverage of the evacuation in large numbers, and now we seem to have forgotten about Afghanistan again. We're certainly not covering what's going on the ground. We're not covering the plight of the refugees. As an editor, talk to us about, how coverage of humanitarian crises has evolved. You've been with Arab News since 2016. What are some of the factors, as someone directing the coverage, that dictate how it can be sustained and sustain the public interest?
Well, in a way, Elise, and I would like to point out that you come from a journalistic background, also formerly with CNN. So the situation in newsrooms around the world is exactly the same. You have an unlimited number of stories and a very limited number of resources. No matter how much resources you put in, you simply cannot cover every catastrophe or every crisis that happens in the world. In a way, it is a bit difficult sometimes to make decisions. Where do you spend these resources? So which catastrophe or which crisis is more worthy of you sending a team to the ground, dispatching a team to the ground? And even if you solve the resource issue, then you have the physical barriers, the logistical challenges of getting into countries. For example, in this current situation, it's a lot easier to send a crew to go to Turkey than go to Syria, be it be it in the areas that are under the regime's control or areas that are not. It's both equally a challenge. This makes it particularly difficult because for us, and then I just have to point out, every life lost is a life too many, and regardless of the nationality. But for a newspaper called Arab News, if I have to choose, for example, at the moment between sending somebody to Syria and sending somebody to Turkey, Syria is an Arab country. It's closer to home. But we ended up having to send somebody to Turkey because we couldn't get physical access to Syria. So these are the kind of challenges, resources, logistics, access, that we have to face on daily basis.
You were talking yesterday, we were talking about Ukraine, and that you had Arab News did a poll, and there was not a lot of interest in what was going on in Ukraine. And as you said, from an editorial perspective, Turkey and Syria much more immediate. Let's look at Turkey right now. we're still in the immediacy of the search and rescue. Still, I mean, thankfully, they're still finding some survivors. But do you think your audience will stay with that story?
Until something bigger happens, unfortunately, this is why they call them news cycles. So at the moment, and we've seen the results. I think in a matter of few days, there's been a public donations campaign here in Saudi through the Sahem platform that gathered more than $55 million from people to help with
$55 million from the public.
From the public, yeah.
And that's from media coverage.
That's from media coverage, plus the government has made it very easy to donate through an application or through a website. So it's a very simple transaction to get that. So I think people do care. It's just the sheer amount, and unfortunately. We are in a plagued part of the world. I know people who come here to Saudi Arabia or go to the Gulf in general, we feel like we are protected from the outside, from the wider Middle East. But if you go around the region, particularly, for example, in places like Syria, which, it's a number of catastrophes, one after the other, the earthquake being the latest, or Lebanon, or Palestine, or these areas, there is certainly no shortage of news to cover in terms of people going through agony and people going through pain. Now, you mentioned a very important point, and I would like to take a moment to talk about Ukraine. As it happens, we did a research with the international polling company YouGov, covering 3,000 Arabs in 19 Arab countries, and this would have been exactly 9 months ago from today. It was for the 3rd month anniversary of Ukraine. An astounding 66% of Arabs said they really don't care, or they are neutral when it comes to, they are indifferent towards the war in Ukraine. And of course, this shows a lot of things. First of all, from a news perspective, and you don't need me to tell you this, as I said, you are an experienced journalist. Crises that are closer to home will always make the headlines. So by default, we care here more about what's happening, for example, in Syria or in Turkey, than a place like Ukraine, which for an American audience or for a European audience might be the other way around. I know it sounds difficult, but this is the reality of us as audiences and as human beings. The other thing it shows is people, and this is where I wanted to emphasize, because I'm on this panel because I'm a journalist first and foremost. When 66% of people say that about a crisis in Ukraine, it doesn't strike me as indifferent as much as it strikes me as people are illiterate or unable to digest how significant this war it is. It's only when you put things in context, and this is where it's more important for us as journalists to drive this context to people. Yes, the war in Ukraine might have nothing to do with us, but when you think about the energy crisis, when you think about grain prices in Egypt going up because Ukraine is the key exporter, then people start realizing and paying attention. But of course, the average Joe on the street, you don't expect them to know all of this. This is why our job is more important. So more important than ever. It's not important. I'm going to conclude on this point. What's important is not just to cover the crisis, because everybody will have that story. Everybody knows there's an earthquake that happened in Turkey. Our job is to explain to the people sitting at home, wherever they're watching us, how this is going to impact you and how this is going to impact you on the long run.
Right. I want to get to that in a minute. I want to go to Brian and Susie and talk, as journalists. Brian, we're looking at all the competing issues that the public faces. It's difficult to break through all the competing news and information and crisis that people themselves are facing, to getting their attention. We went through COVID. The last time we were all here at Chaos Relief, COVID was the big issue, and now there's a financial crisis, and so people are just getting zapped with so many crises and so many stories that it's not that they don't care, but their attention is just elsewhere.
Yes, it does seem like we're in a particular historic moment when we have several global crises, the coronavirus pandemic, global climate change that's affecting many countries. These are global issues. The Ukraine war, testing the international system, and its importance being us deciding whether we want to live in a world where naked aggression becomes another tool of statecraft, as it once was. I think, in this marketplace for our attention, we have, there's different ways to sort of seize the public attention and maintain it, for a cause we consider noble or just or worthy of it. So we have now, I'd say the traditional journalistic example would be trying to find a compelling story angle that's universal in some way. Stories about families, about individual triumphs or failures or struggles, other things like sports, things that can affect a wide audience, sports or animals even. I can think of one anecdote where even in a scene of heavy bombardment, the story that got the most play of the day in Mosul on one day was a video story about a puppy that had been rescued from under the rubble. And from the puppy idea, you build on the story about what's actually going on. I think also you can be non-political about some of these stories because aid donations, humanitarian aspires to be outside of political influence. Aside from that, I'd say also, we have to embrace the new technologies. These we have, they're more entertainment-based, like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok being the new one. It doesn't necessarily help the journalism business model because we don't control this content. And so I would say that those tools are probably best suitable for people directly in the humanitarian world because they can basically cut out the middleman. And I'm speaking against my own profession here, but they can go straight to the public with their news at a very low cost. I guess aside from that, partnerships. We could talk about partnerships.
Yeah, we're gonna get to the partnerships.
Sure.
I wanna go to Susie. Pick up on where Brian was talking about. We have a lot of crises. We have a lot of stories. And then there's just the sheer amount of content that's out there zapping people's attention. It used to be, when I was growing up, we had 3 news networks, a couple of papers, and every country kind of had that. Now you have TikTok, Instagram, and it's not just news and information, but it's wellness, it's fashion, there's just so much content zapping your attention. And you talked about a very interesting statistic the other day. Tell the audience about this. It's astonishing how short people's attention spans are now. And when we're talking about these big international crises, it's even hard to break through.
In 2004, the average attention span on a screen specifically was around 2.5 minutes. And now it's 47 seconds. So
47
seconds.
47 seconds, and then people are like, all right,
and you end up scrolling. I think the scrolling factor is key because, okay, yes, like you say, many of us grew up with 3 channels, network news, and then suddenly we had cable, but not everybody had cable. So yes, you could channel surf, but if you're going for news, you didn't have that many options. Now you have all kinds of different platforms to get your news from. You have traditional television, you have radio, you have podcasts, you have various social media channels, you have newspapers, you have blog. You have so many ways of getting your information, which I am trying to be positive on this front and see this as potentially a blessing, because actually you can potentially reach the kinds of audiences that maybe we wouldn't have through the evening news. And the wellness and fashion and et cetera can potentially be used as, if there's partnerships of sorts, potentially be used as mechanisms to also tell some of these stories that can be stories of hope in humanitarian crises that inspire people. Because, you know, I've had experiences with editors where we've gotten into debates over, well, good stories don't sell, like good news stories don't sell. People don't click on good news stories. But I don't think that's necessarily true, and if it is true, maybe it's across a generational spectrum. The puppy story, the puppies rescued in Mosul, was actually a BBC producer who found these puppies in Mosul, and it ended up on BuzzFeed. I mean, ISIS stories at that time weren't the kinds of stories that would end up on BuzzFeed. So that's a different, that's a younger generation who then, who knows, maybe they see this story and they start looking into what happened with ISIS in Iraq at the time. Mm-hmm. So we have a very different media landscape, and I think it's going to expand even further with the evolution of artificial intelligence, which again might sound scary, like, oh, the robots are coming for all of our jobs. But on the other hand, maybe there's room for some of these resource issues to be solved if some of the kind of busy work is solved by artificial intelligence. Right. So that frees up journalists to do the kind of journalism that we'd all like to be doing.
Right. Rafiq, so I mean, I think what we're all getting at is like some kind of crisis fatigue is inevitable here, given the competing pressures, content, things zapping our attention. How does that have an impact on donor fatigue? It's easy to say donors just have to stay the course no matter what the public thinks, but if people are tired of hearing about Ukraine or Afghanistan or Yemen, less public support makes it hard for donors themselves.
Yes, absolutely. I think attention and levels of funding are quite well correlated in that sense. The more we see public attention to a crisis and to the ongoing relief efforts, the more that translates into the humanitarian system. And I think this is one of the reasons us as humanitarian community, we try to pay close attention to how we communicate our work, but also how we partner with media and how we present that story of what is going on in a certain area with a certain crisis. Present hope, because that more often translates into funding, because when there is hope, there is an action to be implemented for us to get a positive outcome, and that will motivate a donation. And here I think we're trying to influence not just the institutional donors, the governments, who are very much attentive to the breaking news cycles, but also the wider public sector. At UNICEF, for instance, last year, our budget for the entire year everywhere around the world was about 7 billion. Over 2 billion were from the private sector, from individual donors, anyone from the public, from the private, from corporations, foundations, and others, who find us not just through the media cycle, but also through social media, through some of the specialized work that we do, not only via the news, the breaking news cycle, but also through economic news, through, as you mentioned earlier, celebrity and social media spheres. This is why we have Goodwill Ambassadors, because they help us get to wider audiences beyond the daily news. I'll give you a quick example, actually, if I may. I was just talking to our colleagues from KS Relief and others. The Saudi public, for instance, if you want to analyze that as an audience, and I read it on Arab News the other day, 67% of Saudis are gamers. They play video games. So we are teaming up with the Saudi Esports Federation to try and see how can we influence that big segment of the community and involve them in humanitarian action. We've done it 3 years in a row through an initiative that Saudi Arabia hosts called Games Without Borders. Teams compete and the proceeds go to humanitarian action, which is a fantastic initiative. And it's pretty much outside of the news cycle. It gets covered by specialized media that cover the gaming news, which is quite a niche area of the media landscape. But it is important because it touches such a wide segment of society, 67% of the Saudi public, and those numbers are rising across the world. So it's really a way for us to target them. So broadening those partnerships and creating compelling ways to reach the audiences via the breaking news cycle, but also through the specialized media, helps us maintain some level of attention on the humanitarian emergencies. But at the end, we communicate also to advocate beyond funding. It's also about maintaining political pressure on those who are sometimes accountable or have a certain influence on the perspective, on the future of a crisis or a conflict. In the end of the day, people need peace. They don't need humanitarian relief every day. At the end of the day, myself and a few others of my colleagues in the humanitarian sector, or maybe everyone, ultimately we work every day very hard to get fired because we don't want to be here. Right. We want to do something else. We don't want to be doing this forever. At the end of the day, we want to see that humanitarian needs are slowly going away, being replaced by development projects that will reduce the frequency of crisis with preparedness and other action. And this is where we see the funding most impactful, when we invest in the preparedness before a crisis occurs. And this is the hardest point, actually. Funding for a crisis is easy, but for preparedness is actually a lot harder.
Faisal, there's about providing humanitarian relief and focusing on the humanitarian crisis, but I think also audiences, there's this attention to a political solution, and if there's not a political solution and there's no movement, people kind of lose interest. Like, with the Arab Spring, for instance, like people, followed it to their natural conclusion. Mubarak was overthrown, Ben Ali, or what I mean, like Gaddafi was killed, and we were able to quickly move on to the other crisis. But if there's no movement in Syria or somewhere else, or it's pretty much happening in Ukraine too, the long-term struggles in Yemen, for instance, sustaining that interest is hard, and we kind of lose sight of the humanitarian aspect.
Sure, there's a few issues to unpack here. First of all, as I said in my opening remarks, we are in an area of the world that is plagued with these problems, and unfortunately these problems don't go away. According to the United Nations, it takes a refugee a minimum of 15 years to leave a refugee camp. So, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been going on for 70 years. Syria has been ongoing since 2011. So, unfortunately, the best way for a crisis to be resolved is for it not to happen to start with. Once you dive into it, once it happens, it's like quicksand, and it keeps bringing you further and further down. It's not specific to our conflicts. There's a lot of conflicts in the world that don't get resolved that quickly. Humanitarian crisis in particular is even more difficult because whereas, for example, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a conflict, and sometimes you hear people sitting at the table and negotiating. The issue with an earthquake, for example, is the attention is by default focused on those 2 or 3 days or at the incident itself, and then the story will. This is in normal circumstances, and I want to build a little bit on what Susie was mentioning. So, in the good days, before social media, it used to last the attention used to last a few days. I actually read even more dramatic figures than the one that Susie mentioned. What I read, according to the Thread marketing group, is the attention span went down to 8 seconds for the average human being. This means that the next worst thing is the goldfish. So we literally have the attention of a goldfish now. And this is a problem, and for us in the media industry. So this is actually a term that is now becoming popular, something called the attention economy. So marketees and social media experts and businesses are realizing that this is a problem, and the new term now is the attention economy. So people are actually paid to sit and think how to grab your attention for more than those 8 seconds. But of course, this is not the good old days. So as Susie was mentioning, or as yourself was mentioning even, you know, in your days there were 3 cable news networks, or 4, and you know, people's days were structured. You know, at some point people watched the news in the evening, read the newspaper in the morning, and that slot was allocated for news. It got people's full attention for the full 20 minutes or for the full 15 minutes that they read the newspaper. Today you're in a situation where, you know, there's irregularity in the time where you access information. Let's just be blunt. A lot of people even use their phone in the toilet. So there's, you know, people in the toilet looking at their phone and getting incoming information.
We've all done it. Don't say you didn't.
No, I'm just saying, you know, it's that extreme. You know, even more extreme is
Right.
like what really kind of what really irritates me is people who do it while they're driving.
Right.
So, but what I'm trying to say is that, you know, the attention or the time that you used to be able to pay attention when you give full focus to something, and your day was structured, is
Right.
long gone. The problem is now we're talking about crisis fatigue and how to get people attention so that donors are not affected. The problem is you're sitting on your phone, be it in your classroom, be it in your workplace, or be it in a cafe, or you know, on a toilet seat, wherever you are, looking at the phone. You're getting feeds. Yes, you're getting the latest news from Syria or from Turkey, but you're also getting your latest celebrity, your favorite celebrity news.
Right, as we were saying.
You're getting a makeup tutorial. You're getting a
Right,
cooking recipe.
right.
You're getting business advice
Right.
from a you know, known
Right.
investor. Or so. We're not comparing apples. We're not competing apples to apples anymore. It's no longer the CBS News versus the NBC News at 8 o'clock. So you're actually competing as a news provider. You're competing every moment with Netflix, with Google, with Amazon, with you know. People share. The last statistics I want to say is people share 1 billion Instagram reels a day. You know, there's 1 billion Instagram reels shared every day, and this is like this. The clock resets every midnight. So. With that amount of information, no wonder this kind of attention economy. But the downside of it is, by default, we're going to pay less attention to crisis because the sheer amount of things
Right.
being thrown at you.
Right. Brian, let's talk about funding. I mean, we all know it's less available than it used to be, and there are no shortage of journalists that are willing to go, but it's not just journalists, right? I mean, when we go, we need a whole architecture in place, just like the aid organizations do.
Sure, we're talking about on-the-ground reporting in crisis zones, or
Well, if you're going, if your organization is sending you, you're not just going as like Brian, you need security, you need a whole architecture in place.
Oh yes, well this type of reporting is very expensive. You need security teams, you need people monitoring your situation. Sometimes you need to pay off armed groups on the ground. Now, I mean, one of the problems with traditional legacy media is that we don't necessarily report something unless it's new. So news is something that's new. So one of the challenges is with these crises, like a long-running drought, is how to keep something that's not really new. And this is where people on the ground can help, because finding these little details in daily life, that can be turned into a story, a feature story that then gets resonance. But I think when it comes to assistance for reporting and working in crisis zones, especially conflict zones, which, as we heard earlier today, make up 80% of all humanitarian crises. Piggybacking on an aid organization is often the safest way to work. I know that they have probably the best intentions when they come up with their statistics, and I would say that those numbers are often more trustworthy than numbers provided by state organizations, because the ability to be on the ground in different locations and coordinate across territory. I think the aid organizations are better equipped for that.
Mm-hmm. Susie, I mean, then we talk about partnerships, right? Like, you know, I want to ask Rafiq as well, but as an organization, like you say, okay, I'm going to send a team with UNICEF, or I'm going to send a team with, you know, into a conflict zone with an aid organization. For something like the BBC, yes, you have budget cuts, but then partnering is also difficult because, you know, you have your charter and you have your rules of engagement.
It's very difficult. Partnering is very difficult because, you know, there's the whole we have to remain impartial aspect, which is building trust with our audiences. And so who we partner with is very important. I mean, my series that I host, Women Building Peace, which is about women in conflict zones and the work they do in conflict zones, was partnered with Georgetown's Institute of Women, Peace and Security. But that truthfully was difficult to pull off, but we were able to pull it off because, you know, they're an academic institution and the goals were aligned and there weren't any other issues. There have been other programs that I've tried to get off the ground which are similar in kind of countering disinformation, focusing on humanitarian crises, and partnering with places that would have a lot of money, bigger organizations that would have a lot of money. We haven't been able to get it off the ground precisely because there's concerns about potential impartiality breaches.
Rafiq, talk to us about partnering with journalists. And you've said to me that media is part of the aid system.
It is. This is pretty much how we see it. We see that the media sector journalists are part of the humanitarian aid system. They're an integral part of it. Information, the news, they do save lives. We have to know that and acknowledge it. The more we cover the stories, the better job we do at conveying that information. It actually helps people in a direct way, much more direct than we might think. And this is why, for us, shared value partnerships with the media are so important. You spoke about impartiality. For the humanitarian community, our principles are humanity, integrity, neutrality, and impartiality, and we share those with the media. So it's a natural partnership, and we try and implement that in concrete ways. Brian mentioned a few examples, and I think earlier Faisal also mentioned the issues of access. On access, for instance, yes, as a humanitarian community, we are, and we do our best to be in the hardest to reach areas, to deliver our aid in the most remote, most dangerous areas.
Sometimes you're operating in areas where where a regime is controlling access, and you...
Regardless of who is in access, we do our best to ensure that access is there, because in the end of the day, this is how we deliver our operations. A quick example, for instance, sometimes when everything else is shut down, the only way in and out of a crisis country is the UN humanitarian air service or another type of logistical route. And it is open only for the humanitarian community plus media. We do actually let journalists come with us on humanitarian missions for this reason. It's because we believe that people need to know what is going on. That will affect not only our funding, but will also bring the attention to what long-term solutions are needed. It will help maintain focus. And I think also it's a way to be accountable to the children and families that we serve, conveying their story to the world, demonstrating that we are there, telling their stories. I think it's a powerful way to show accountability to them, to show respect also, to tell them that we are here, the world has not forgotten about you. And this is, as a communication officer for a UN entity, I hear that a lot. Every time I go on a field mission, including in the hardest areas, that's something that always resonates with people. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I went on a mission into a town that had been besieged by military entities for months on end. What we saw are staggering levels of malnutrition, of deprivation, of humanitarian need. We went in, and I'm sorry, when I think of this, it always affects me. So we came in with trucks of food, education supplies, psychosocial experts who worked with us, and the traditional relief items that you see and we bring in. And I was there with a camera, and it was really interesting to see how many people went to the doctors, to the nutritionists, and also how many people came to the camera because they wanted to talk, they wanted to speak, they wanted to convey their message. It was such a powerful thing. And the other piece of information that I got from out of that mission was a lady who approached me and asked me for a lighter. And like everyone else, when someone asks for a lighter and you don't smoke, you say, sorry, I don't smoke. But then it hit me, and a colleague told me later, she doesn't smoke, probably. She just hasn't seen a lighter in months. She needs to light up a fire to cook. And that's not really the traditional humanitarian relief item that you bring as a part of a humanitarian convoy. So ultimately, what people need is go back to their normal lives. And while we cannot bring lighters, we cannot bring oil, heating oil and so on, and those necessities that all of us enjoy every day, electricity and so on, these people had it. It's children, families who had normal lives, they got affected by crisis, they had been forgotten for the longest time, and it is our duty and a part of our accountability to them to convey their messages and to bring the attention back to them.
So I'm going to go to Faisal and then we'll go to you. In our field, the word partner, right, it has a little bit of a dirty connotation, right? Because when it comes to humanitarian work, but when it comes to humanitarian work, and Rafiq is speaking so eloquently and passionately, I mean, how do you avoid, you want to have the partner, you want to be an advocate, not an activist, but I mean, it is, how do you as an editor get the best out of a reporter and the access that you're getting? Sometimes it's not about budgets, it's about access, as Rafiq said. But also make sure that that impartiality, and you know, you're not drawing a moral equivalence, but that objectivity remains. Because we talked about this the other day when we were preparing for the panel. Like, you can't tell me when I'm not going out with UNICEF that I'm not feeling as strongly and my emotions are not as involved as someone on the ground there.
Well, 100%. Look, the short answer is it's exactly the same way you choose any partner in life, be it a business partner, be it a romantic partner. You know, you have to choose the partner carefully. But for a more detailed answer, this has always been the case with journalism. If you remember, during the Iraq War, the term embedded journalists came in. And what the definition of embedded journalists are, these are a number of reporters, war correspondents, that in agreement with the US Army, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, they report, but they give up a little bit of the control over the story in return for access and protection, because these are very dangerous areas. In the entertainment world, the publicist for you know, a musician or an actress or an actor will exchange the currency is the access in return for favorable stories. And it really depends on the journalist or the editor's code of ethics and values to decide where to draw the line. But in the world of humanitarian aid, in the world of crisis such as the earthquake, there are times where we say, you know what, this is something that we go all out on, and we just declare. The key issue here is you have to declare and make your audience aware that this story is brought to you in collaboration or thanks to access by UNICEF or by the Red Cross or by the Red Crescent. And as long as you do that, then you're not tricking your audience. But of course, you need to trust the partner you're dealing with. You need to have this sort of gentleman agreement before going in. And it needs, you know, if you're going to do that, you need to be ensuring that you're getting the value for your audience or your readers?
Susie.
So we're television people, right? And so we look at stories through visuals. And there have been multiple times in my career where I've gotten great access to something, but it hasn't been a good TV story. And the editors have kind of not been interested because it hasn't been a good TV story. And so I think when you're coming from an organization like yours perspective, I mean, if I were in your communications shop, I would think about like what kind of, because you're competing for journalists' attention as much as you're competing for the audience's attention. So what's going to get a journalist's attention that then they can go and take it to their editor and get their editor's attention, and kind of angles and stories that maybe we haven't heard of and we haven't thought of, and then it becomes perhaps less about necessarily partnerships, but more about what kind of access do you have. I mean, earlier today I was speaking to someone who was telling me a story about how they'd facilitated the transfer of dead soldier bodies between Ukrainian families and Russian families. And I mean, that to me sounded, I hadn't heard that story before. And that's a visual story. Now, if that's something that editors would go for, well, if it's on the anniversary of the Ukraine invasion, then yes, maybe, because they're all, broadcasters are always planning big days of coverage around anniversaries. That's kind of a way of covering something when you throw all of your resources on one day. But then unfortunately the byproduct of that is that they pull resources for the next 6 months or whatever until there's another anniversary that they can justify spending money on. So I think access is like what kind of access you're giving the journalists is really important. What they're going to see, how is that going to push the story forward? How is it going to compel the audience? And then, frankly, yes, resources are slim, but at least in my experience, I always hear about how resources are slim, and then some big sporting events happen, and there's like plenty of money to spend. So, it's just like food for thought.
Brian, we've talked about how, people are very concerned, for instance, in Turkey and Syria right now, but, the needs are going to be great for a very long time, and people are going to go back to their lives. In talking about what kind of coverage we can do to sustain that heightened awareness, maybe it's promoting, as Faisal was saying earlier, what the consequences are for the individual audience member, whether it's, in Ukraine, food shortages in Egypt, or, gas shortages in Europe, like making the audience feel more of a connection to the story.
Oh yeah, well, we were talking about how local news is often considered more important by people. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's kind of understandable why somebody in Poland who speaks a dialect similar to Ukrainian will find that news more interesting, or why someone in Saudi Arabia would find news about Syria more interesting. That's a question, I think, for the aid organizations and how they want to sort of market their donor campaigns. But I'm not sure I heard the entire question. Are we?
Well, how do we sell this story? Is it, this person is suffering, or, do we make the audience feel more of a connection through how it affects their own lives?
Sure. Yeah. There's lots of ways to find universal themes that affect everybody, that are cross-cultural. Stories about families, stories about children. You can go for the sports angles sometimes, entertainment angles, and these are things that engage a broader audience that wouldn't necessarily want to read a sad story about an earthquake somewhere. Aside from that, also the odd stories are always attract attention. I mean, there's lots of different ways to find. I think stories that stand out, stories that seem uncommon sometimes.
Right. Rafiq, what about, we were talking earlier about how you package it is really going to determine, we have to get out of the breaking news component of it and more get back to the storytelling aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned it earlier when when talking about the breaking news cycle and going into more mainstream, everyday storytelling via multiple channels at once. But I think the breaking news is what gets a lion's share from of attention globally. I think these are the stories that resonate the most. So they're still fairly important for us to chase and pursue and try to package our work around the big headlines. Is it new numbers, new studies that we do on ongoing crisis or on recent crisis? So, and we try to remain relevant and proactive in coming out with those human stories as part of a bigger crisis. Like, COVID, for instance, was the story for 2-3 years worth of news cycles. And we tried to, and I think we succeeded in bringing the human element of it quite well. And that translated fairly well into the amount of funding that we got for vaccine delivery and so on, though the issue of equity in the beginning was a bit of a challenge. But I think the pressure that all of us as a global community of media and humanitarian development actors, we actually made quite an impact on addressing those inequities in the beginning. But still, COVID will continue to affect people on the long term. A study that we released last year with the World Bank, and this was a major headlines, and I think everyone here covered it, was that this generation of students will lose $17 trillion in lifetime earnings due to COVID, school closures, and everything that has affected their learning. So the effect of that crisis will continue forever for them. But I think the other ways, I think, on packaging is the work that I mentioned, for instance, earlier on gaming and so on. But we talked also about celebrities and how we work with goodwill ambassadors who are from the film industry, art, sports, and so on. We try to build those partnerships with the broader media and entertainment sector who have massive reach across the world, who have the power to influence not just the policy making, the politician, but also the wider public, who can influence those in power, but also can take action themselves. And it's really important for us also to package our stories into an action-oriented, engaging way, because information by itself will not lead to a positive outcome. It has to be associated with a strong and concrete and clear call to action, one that either that policymaker that needs to make a certain decision will understand what the decision is, how to implement it, and what will be the outcome, but also individuals who are reading a story on a newspaper or watching it on TV or scrolling on a phone. I think we have to make it really clear for them that they can play a part. So packaging that story in an engaging way helps address that ever shortening attention span.
And the cost of inaction, too.
Exactly.
Faisal, it's really easy, to blame the media. Someone got killed because the media wasn't doing their job, or the media wasn't there, or, people are suffering because of the media. But, there are challenges that we also spoke about, whether it's budgets or attention spans or this. But it's also a responsibility. It's also a responsibility for us to make them care.
100%. And look, there is no question about the importance that media in all its forms plays. And I would ask you to take a moment to look at the flip side of that. You're from the States. You remember the Pizzagate a few years ago, where a fake news story was published, and as a result, about a pedophilia ring inside a pizza shop, and then which wasn't true, and then somebody took a rifle and shot innocent people. I remember a story that came out in the same year about finding the CIA agent who leaked Hillary Clinton's emails killed. And that was a case study that we studied. And that story, published in a newspaper called the Denver Guardian, got more shares than the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times combined. Now, there was two problems there. First of all, the story was fake, and as an American journalist, you know that there's no such thing called the Denver Guardian. So what I'm trying to say is, it's very easy to set up a fake news site. It's very easy to share fake news stories. People will always click on the more sensational headlines, and they have real-life consequences. But going back to my opening remarks, this by default means that the job for us now as professional, responsible journalists is more important than ever. And if we are going, if we are going to take on the reality of this world, which is artificial intelligence, which is the easiest spread of fake news, then this makes the job, what we are doing more important than ever. The only question now is the tools. So how do you compete with actually a supercharged engine, such as the world of algorithms? It's definitely not with the typewriter and not with the paper print anymore. I think artificial intelligence, especially with the developments now with what we're seeing in ChatGPT, is going to help expedite and help us do our job so that we can support people working in the humanitarian field and allow people to attract people's attention to the just causes and the real ones. Because it's very easy now to mislead people, even get them to donate to a cause that doesn't exist.
Rafiq, do you worry about, or are you enthused by the advent of these artificial intelligence or all of this technology? Do you get lost in it, or is it going to be a tool for you?
It's a really good question, and I think there's a massive opportunity there. From a point of view that children and families who are affected by humanitarian crisis, by disasters, they're often already suffering from a massive digital divide. And we've seen this, for instance, during, as I mentioned earlier, the school closures, where everyone else went online, but people who were living in humanitarian crisis were left a bit behind. So now with the acceleration and democratization of this technology, having ways to speed up accessibility for everyone, there's a massive opportunity for us actually to get education programs wider, to get into the quality of education, improving that. So I think the opportunities outweigh the risks here. But we have to be smart about it. The digital divide is a real hurdle, not just in humanitarian response, but also towards sustainable development. The key to development will and is the digital economy that is upon us. And I think we have to think about it from a humanitarian point of view as well. We are working with some of the top players in the industry, the Microsofts and the Googles and the others, on learning passports and other digital platforms that we are rolling out to children and to students in the most difficult humanitarian areas. And we are trying also to integrate some of that learning into their curriculum. So they're not just hearing about artificial intelligence, about all the news and latest tech, but they also be part of it. And we are seeing a huge interest. People are born with mobiles in their hands today. Like they're going straight into the mobility, into the digital world. And there are a lot of opportunities there. Now, what worries us is that internet itself is still not the safest place for children, especially those who are already vulnerable by poverty and other risks around them. So ensuring that we keep that internet, that digital space safe for children is a huge priority for us.
Yeah. I want to open up the floor to any questions. Does anybody have a question? Raise your hand. Anybody? Sir? We bring him a mic.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I think all of us must accept the very important role of the media, not only in highlighting human tragedy and human challenges, but also what needs to be done. And in many ways, the pragmatist in me accepts that media often is about the drama, because the drama is what attracts attention. But the question I will have to each of you as the panelist, how can media move us from drama to inspiration, from the drama of the tragedy to the inspiration of how we can make the human condition better? Thank you very much.
It's a great question. It's a great question, and I'm going to put something on top of on that. Do we want to be do we want to be inspired, or are we about doom and gloom, and is that what attracts people? Rafiq, let me start with you.
It is one of our guiding principles to prioritize hope in the way we package our information. Because if we communicate only about the negative side, about the state of despair, that will actually discourage action, discourage people coming and lending a helping hand. So we want to show that there is hope. We want to show that there is a positive way out of any crisis. And I'm privileged to work at UNICEF, and for us it's fairly easy to do that, because we want to say, look, these children, they are in the middle of a crisis. They will grow up, and this crisis will be behind them. So how can we work today to give them that chance to grow up safe, to recover from the psychological trauma, to catch up on education, to have the healthcare, to have their rights safeguarded in the middle of all of these catastrophes? And how can we ensure that out of all this negativity, we can come together as a community, media, international community, to overcome it? And I think this is what the story ought to be, about hope. And we see it, I think, in the coverage that we all have, including in the breaking news cycles. And we should do more of it, but by showing that in the end of the day, it's not about the crisis itself, it's about the people who are living in the middle of that crisis.
Susie.
Perhaps it's not necessarily about being inspired. I think inspiration is different for different people. What inspires people is different. I think maybe it's about feeling moved. And when you were just speaking, I was thinking about some of the stories that I'd done that were people focused, and the audience response that I got from them. And one of them was a story that I did about Syrian refugee children. They were in the Zatari camp, and I believe it was probably UNICEF now, actually, who put up a large canvas around the camp and just kind of allowed the children to express themselves through art. And it was just a simple TV package that I did for the BBC, but it was just pictures, really. And the pictures that these 5-year-old children had drawn were so gut-wrenching that some of the response that we got from the audience was, like they were moved by this one simple television piece. I mean, my series, Women Building Peace, the Ethiopia episode was particularly gruesome because I had a survivor of sexual violence, and we have this show which is about kind of audience calls in and we talk about the making of the show. And one person wrote in and said that when they listened to this episode, they had to pull into the driveway to continue listening to it because they found it so moving. Now, was that inspiring necessarily? I mean, I don't know. I feel like you probably wouldn't say the word inspiring for that kind of story. But it is about the people, and I think people do create some sort of reaction in our audience, people's stories. I mean, one of the stories from the Turkey and Syria earthquake that has resonated so much is the baby that was found and fed and washed and
Well, I
was
think
smiling.
that's hope, right?
That's
Right.
that's inspiration, right? That's resilience that is
Right.
inspirational.
Brian.
I think it's a very lofty goal to have the uplifting of human imagination as an objective for the media. I don't think it's ever really been a part of the traditional media objectives, which are more sort of focused on shining light where it's not highlighting injustices, putting information out so that, it focuses on the world as it is, not as it should be. That's the world of editorialists, right? That's my view. I think that said, you can also have solution ideas in voices of analysts. I mean, when you're trying to be neutral in a news story, a written news story, it doesn't have normative ideas. You can add, obviously, a voice of somebody who proposes a solution, and I think that there's a place for that for sure. And there's also different areas of the media that provide inspiration, maybe the arts, science, certain verticals.
What do you think? I mean, should
Oh,
we? Is that a cynical view, or
no, I agree with Brian. Life is cruel. We need to show it as it is. Life is cruel. Remember wait. Remember last year the Moroccan boy that fell inside the well, and that was live coverage, and everybody's inspirations and hopes were high. Unfortunately, the boy died. That's reality. That's life. We cannot airbrush life. We
can't airbrush it, but could we? Should we be solutions based, or should we just,
We can be both.
We're not
Can
the
we
United.
do both?
We're not the United Nations. We tell the story. We report the story. There are people whose job it is who are much better than me in finding solutions. My job is to give them a platform. But again, life is cruel. If they can't find the solution, it's my job to say they couldn't find the solution. I'm quite sure people were very frustrated with the World Health Organization during COVID because they simply couldn't find the solution, or they couldn't tell people the reassurance they needed to hear. But that's reality. As I said, we cannot airbrush it, we cannot beautify it, we cannot add makeup, we cannot give it a
Can't
facelift.
put lipstick on a pig is
No,
what they say
exactly,
in the
yeah.
U.S. Sir, in front.
اسمحوا لي أن أسأل باللغة العربية. أسعد الله مساءاتكم بكل خير. سؤالي هو للأستاذ فيصل وللأخ رفيق، ولعله إن شاء الله لما يردوا على السؤال باللغة الإنجليزية يستفيد من الأطراف الآخرين. أنا أعمل في المجال الخيري من 18 عام. كان لدي تساؤل مهم، يعني أحتاج إلى إجابة. هل نحن في الوقت الراهن بحاجة إلى إعلام تنموي؟ هذا الإعلام التنموي يحدد فيه المدخلات الإنسانية من تعاليم دين الإسلامي والممارسات التنموية، ويحدد أيضاً الأنشطة والممارسات حتى يخرج منه نتائج ومخرجات وأثر، يعود هذا الأثر من الناحية البيئية والناحية الاجتماعية والناحية الاقتصادية التي تتوافق مع أهداف التنمية المستدامة والتوجهات العالمية، وأيضاً رؤية وطننا الغالي، رؤية المملكة 2030. وأتمنى أسمع إجابة. شكراً لكم.
Faisal, do you want to start and then we'll go to Rafiq?
So allow me to summarize and translate the question very quickly. So the kind gentleman here works in humanitarian aid, and he was asking, is it now the time to have a specialized, what he described in Arabic as developmental media, which focuses on humanitarian work, which, noble causes, and will that have a better impact than the traditional media outlets? I have an answer, but maybe Rafiq wants to start with the answer.
First, thank you for the question. I think some of these specialized outlets already exist. We have the New Humanitarian that focuses on humanitarian news, especially from the forgotten, marginalized crisis. We have Relief Web, which provides the same type of services that you're mentioning. the news and updates from the various humanitarian development organizations, and they do try to link it not just to the crisis but also to the outcomes and the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, but I think, will that go mainstream? I don't really know. Though some of the numbers that I saw the other day for Relief Web, they are reaching 20 million visitors a year. That's quite good for a hyper-specialized news portal. But now, will it be bigger? For my case, I hope it will. But I think also, I hope that such specialized portals can help bring some of those top news go mainstream to the big wires, international ones, and regional media as well.
So any media outlet really is a triangle of three factors that puts it together. The audience, the content, and the advertiser or the financier of that outlet. So you need those three elements in any sort of media operation to succeed. If any of them falls, then it will not be sustainable or not be effective. For example, if you have great content but no audience, it's as good as nothing. If you want to create good content and you have an audience but you don't have the means to produce it, then it's as good as not doing it. For me, regardless of if it's specialized or not specialized, the focus should always be on the principles behind it. As long as the story is true, as long as you're doing your job and presenting a fair and balanced view of the world, that's what really matters, and that's what's going to resonate with people. My issue with specialized media outlets, as noble as the cause is, sometimes we get carried away, the issue there is you'll be doing the cause itself a disservice if you become overzealous and exaggerate the facts or the harm or etc. So this is why I go back to what I said, which is it's the values and the professional guidelines that matter, regardless if it's a general interest media outlet or a specialized media outlet.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question over here in the green. Yes.
Hi all, thank you very much. I have a question, and we spoke about technology and how it presents massive opportunities on ground. And from a perspective on development, have we considered that maybe the advancement in technologies that is happening on ground may add to the inequality somehow? Because when we focus on when we leverage only on the opportunities that tech provides, sometimes we overlook. Do you guys have any plans or ways to mitigate that risk of adding it to the inequality? Same applies to journalism. And with advancement in technologies and stuff, do you see any risks and on how that affects the story that you guys tell?
Susan?
I mean, I think that this is already a problem that we're seeing that's quite unfortunate, and I'm speaking on my personal opinion for this. BBC Arabic radio has just closed, which is a huge blow for the region, because a very large population relies on that, and that kind of makes the assumption that a large part of the population is going to get this news that they would get from the traditional radio channel elsewhere in a digital form, which we can't make that assumption. That's not necessarily the case. So I think it is an issue, and I think it is an issue that needs attention.
Brian?
Yeah, I would say technology has helped in some instances, like mobile phones, for example. More people in developing countries have mobile phones and can access information that way than could via newspapers or magazines in the past. That said, the easiest form of communication in terms of news has been radio, because that reaches a crowd without having to have any expensive technology. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, the technology advancement.
Okay, I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you to KS Relief, thank you to my panel, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. And I think we all agree that these type of stories are needed. I think these partnerships are important. I think there are these new technologies that we need to embrace, and we need to go that extra mile in not just covering the breaking news when it happens in the immediacy of a crisis, but continue to find new, different, and evolving ways to not just cover the people affected by the story, but the consequences of inaction for those that are watching the story. Thank you very much.